Howdy, all of you delicious people. I want to make one claim before going into this because I feel immediately when I go into this movie that I'm probably not the target audience of this film. So, my way of reviewing this is because I don't feel that I'm the target audience of this. Plus, also, I'm obviously not the target audience just because, I am to just immediately think of all the things that this movie is to be compared to while watching it. Like, Netflix just goes and chucks anything out there because they have the money to burn, in all brutal honesty. Like, if there was ever a time where Netflix wanted to sponsor somebody, I would be more than happy to go through their content and watch all their stuff and be sponsored by them. Like, believe me, I'd probably be, easily be swayed to do that. But Netflix just chucks a lot of stuff out. That's obvious. And I know that Nightbooks was actually adapted from an actual book. When I actually Googled images of this movie, I also found that there was a book to be put out. That coming from that exact Nightbook story, or if it's just a combination of things, or whatever it is. But I honestly just feel like this movie is just a ASS attempt at a Nightbooks film. Plus, also, here is my thought process of this movie. I have seen this movie called Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, and that feels exactly, identically like this. So for me, I'm just like, we've already had this kind of story, and actually, Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, is a way better overall film. Like, they take a lot more time for the little story parts in that movie, and I think they pull it off 100 times better than what this thing does. There is just a half ASS kind of thing going on here in this movie that I don't enjoy. Like, the when we get to the little story parts, I'm just like, God, this feels just so lazy. Like, all these stories just don't feel all that interesting to me, and they it feels like all the little stories are just to be chucked out there to just deem any of this just non-important. It's just like, man, I just can't wait to the next part when all these little stories are over to get to the real story of a thing that I'm not really all that interested in, because it's just the repeat over and over of the same kind of thing over and over for through a bulk of this film, of a kid having to come up with a story. uh Natasha's character, who is to be played by Kristen Ritter, who usually kind of just plays a heavily annoyed character throughout most of her career, seemingly, with the exclusion of Breaking Bad. She doesn't feel like an annoyed character in that. But it seems like when she was in Jessica Jones, she was kind of an annoyed character. Now she comes back here and is an annoyed character. I like Kristen. Don't get me wrong. If I'm even saying her name even somewhere correctly, I actually just want her to do something that she hasn't done. It kind of feels like I'm seeing a lot of shades of Jessica Jones in this performance. And she, of course, plays this evil witch in this movie, which, just speaking of which, how I did that there. It just feels like there's a lot of stuff here that's just ripping off of other things that don't feel all that unique. And then the movie just ends with a way, of course, that of course it does, because you have to have a happy ending. Because if one person is to tell us throughout this entire movie, there is no happy endings. No happy endings. Everyone just has to just have a poor time and whatever. But there always has to be a happy ending at the end of a movie, for the most part, unless it's a horror film. an actual horror film. I don't know what genre this is to be dipped into, but meh, it is what it is. Could be horror. I don't know. Doesn't seem like that to me. So, I am obviously not the target audience of this, so take my review with, like, you should probably obviously go to another person that reviews this that is to probably be of, of a person that will probably lie to you and say, man, this movie was the best thing I've ever seen because it feels so original and so unique, because it won't. It shouldn't, and they'll lie to you. But, like, I just did not like this film. It almost felt like Hocus Pocus to me in some kind of shades, where you have a cat that all of a sudden is to kind of be like the helper cat in this movie. I'm like, this is like Hocus Pocus to me. Like, you have the witches and you have the cat that, like, doesn't talk, which that's kind of sad. I wish the cat talked. That would have been great. Like, I would have loved another film where a cat talks, but it doesn't happen. But it seems bizarrely that the cat at some points helps both the kids in this thing. So I'm like, Hocus Pocus, it's basically the same thing. You have a boy and a girl, and then eventually, like, there should have been another girl that came in and could have been even more like Hocus Pocus, but still, it is what it is. So here's the thing. So this kid is like, his life is on the line to forcibly write these books, but instead he just consistently just goes right back to just, well, instead of coming up with anything brand spanking new, he just copies and pastes from his books that he already has exists and just starts reading off of those, because this kid, Alex, has writer's block at, like, I'm sorry, if your life is on the line and you have to come up with the story and you're just like, well, F it, I can't come up with anything. Like, you could have just, like, we just have this kid just resting on these books that he's already made and put together. But then eventually it comes to a time in the story where they have to come up with some kind of route to have this kid not being able to rest upon these books. And I'm just like, of course. Like, of course it goes that route. Like, there is so much about this where it was kind of a predictable movie, where I'm just like, there's got to be some way for this to not work out. And then, surefire enough, it's a very predictable movie. It's a very just like, well, there's got to be a way for this to be a much more interesting movie, and it never does. It never does. Even when we get towards the end, when eventually we find out more things about these characters, it just goes into, like, this just feels so random, or just so much of a half ASS kind of thing, that it just never gets good. It never gets to the point where I'm just like, oh man, I'm watching this and it's getting better. No, like, it just is flat the whole way. It's just a heavily flat movie. Also, speaking of flat, you might be hearing the pitter-patter of things. It's raining outside. There's nothing I can do about the weather to quiet that down or anything. So if you're hearing something of pitter-patter, you're getting annoyed, I apologize. But there's nothing I can do. Weather is happening. Sorry. So, with that said, let's go into that double 5-time territory, because it is that thing called, again, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can do spoil this movie. So we end up having Alex, who is to, of course, be this kid who writes all these books. But all of a sudden, for some reason, that doesn't really get explained to us until the end of the movie, which is kind of just dumb. We have Alex, who is to want to tear through and destroy all of his Nightbooks. And I will easily tell you why in the very beginning of this story, instead of waiting till the very end, which they goofily do. So, Alex was to eventually try and get his best friend to come to his home, that for this guy's birthday, his parents is to change up this guy's entire home to be this haunted house for these people to come through. One whole person. Okay. So Alex is to ask this friend, hey, you want to come over to my house? And all of a sudden, his friend of his is to say, like, well, you know what? Like, I have another friend who has this, like, party going on, and it seems like really cool what he's putting together. And Alex is just like, well, yeah, but I have a party at my house. And the guy is just like, well, yeah, but you know what? Like, I just want to go to this friend because I like him better. Like, there's, like, stuff about you that I just don't quite like compared to him. And so I'm going to go to his party. And so all of a sudden, Alex, who only had, I guess, one friend to come to this party because no one else would have gone. Like, I'm sorry, kid. Like, there's a lot of kids out there that is going to consistently always have that kind of problem. Like, especially, like, luckily this kid probably didn't, like, move around, like, 18 different times to eventually have to come up with friends everywhere he was to go. And so it's like, yeah, like, freaking boo-hoo, kid. Boo-hoo, kid! Like, no one's gonna come to your birthday party. Oh, boo-hoo. Like, that happens to everybody. That happens a lot. You don't have, like, a billion friends that at the drop of the hat, like, come to your birthday. So what? Boo-hoo. That is so awful that I said that, but, like, hey, like, freaking it happens. But, like, I would like the Ryan Reynolds Just Friends kind of route of things, where all of a sudden, like, we have Alex who's just like, well, I'm going to become this big fancy writer that makes $1 million for every book. And, like, that's who I'm going to become. I'm going to drive myself now to become this big fancy writer. And then everybody is going to want to come to my house every single year. Like, that's what Alex should have done, is instead of tearing up all his books because all of his friends are rejecting him, instead turn around and use that thing to drive you to become the best person that you could possibly be. That's what I would have liked this story to have eventually been, but instead, because of this heartbreak, because of this kid having problems, like, getting friends or whatever, like that, but the whole driving force thing would have been a lot better for this story, but instead it just turns around and is this. So that's where I would be irritated with this story already. So Alex goes on and is to tear away through his books, just like boo-hoo crying, because he's just like, no, none of my friends like me. Oh, well. Like, I'm just so, like, I already know that people will probably hate this review by me saying this, but, like, some people have tough childhoods. Oh, well. So this kid should have had the driving force of becoming a really good novelist, but instead, so all of a sudden we end up having eventually Alex getting sucked into this weird, bizarre-ish, like, home in this other dimension where it seems like he cannot leave. And so all of a sudden we have Natasha, who is to be this witch, who is to tell Alex, like, what unique ability do you have? After she has this weird mask to scare, supposedly, Alex, which doesn't really exactly work. So this witch is to ask Alex, what unique thing can you do? And, like, this kid just says, well, I write books. I'm like, wait a minute. So this kid wanted to stop writing books, but then he says the one unique thing that he can do is write books, or he's a storyteller. Which I'm like, okay, isn't that a freaking backwards, like, again, like, that's what bugged the crap out of me. This kid is trying to get rid of and stop doing this, but he says his one unique talent is writing books. So Natasha is just like, great, then you're going to write books every single day. every single day you're going to give me a story every single day. So this kid is to take a whole entire day and just try to come up with a story, but he can't. And he goes into this whole huge room filled with books, and he's like, I can't come up with a story. I'm gonna just I'm just gonna have to just take what stories I already have from my night books, my backpack full of night books, and just say all those. While all of a sudden, eventually Alex is to stumble upon certain kind of books that all of a sudden are to have this weird, bizarrish, message hidden within them that he continues to try to find and read. So every single one of these Nightbook stories that he tells Natasha is just to buy time for him to read these secret messages in these books about a girl who ends up having some unicorn necklace thing that is to help her get the heck out of here, anyways, we end up finding out towards the end of this film that Natasha is actually the unicorn wielding necklace person. And I'm like, how is it that we don't recognize that until the very end of the film? Had Natasha always been wearing this unicorn necklace? How is it that we haven't seen that up until now? Because if this girl is to always wear this necklace, how is it that we never saw this? Because I guess most of the time she had been hiding that, interestingly enough. Whatever. That seemed really flimsy, where it's like, oh, this girl always wore the unicorn necklace, and then coincidentally we don't see the unicorn necklace to the very end of the film, coincidentally, when they were willing to just say, oh yeah, we now know that this girl had the unicorn necklace. Whatever it is, whatever. So this kid starts popping out stories from his already night books, and so one of them is to be called this playground story, where we have all these like zombified looking kids who are to play in this playground with this seemingly normal looking kid, human looking kid. And we end up finding out that these zombies are actually ghosts. Ghosts? Like, they look like zombies, but they're ghosts. And I'm like, okay, get the makeup right then. Like, CGI them looking like they're ghosts or something. Like, these characters look like zombies, and this doesn't quite make sense. So, and it seems like these kids have been stuck here for a while in this, like, Bermuda Triangle looking place that, like, these kids have been there for decades. And so eventually we have at some point Natasha always butting into all these stories because there's always some inaccuracy about what this kid is to deliver. So she's always butting in for some reason or another, and I can't remember every single time that she butts in for every single story. And so, like, basically there's really just a whole like 2 to 3 stories that this kid really talks about, and even that, it feels like the stories are heavily rushed to just get these out there. So eventually the very first story is to supposedly have it where this boy ends up re-meeting back up with his sister that I guess was a ghost and was stuck in this playground. And so eventually he ends up talking to her and I guess getting the closure that he needs to go back home. I'm like, I don't understand this story whatsoever. What was the point of the kid going to this playground and then, like, leaving or whatever? So, like, we eventually have Natasha, who's to mention, like, no happy endings. I don't want a story that has a happy ending. And so then this kid has to change the story to eventually make every single time that if someone was to get an up advantage on somebody, like, then that person would still have to die in the end for whatever goofy reason, because he would have to change the story to eventually just have this person die. And this story again would just be this like, oh yeah, and the girl got the advantage over the sorcerer, but the girl just died at the end because the monster came back and ate her. I'm like, okie dokie, that was great. No, that story was great. It's just, so so we have bizarrely we have Alex and this girl Yaz or Yasmin. Yasmin is to be this girl that I guess is to do these like chores and and then Alex is doing the stories. So we consistently have both Yaz and Alex who are having these like back and forth arguments about everything. Like this Yasmin girl is kind of telling Alex what's going on, and we have at points in time where Alex is desperately thinking that he's going to escape, and Yasmin is like, dude, you're never going to escape here. It's never going to happen. Don't even try. But Alex continues to try to sneak out a exit door, and it just never happens. Like, really, anything that they are to try to get the heck out of there is never going to work. So what ends up happening is that we have every single time Natasha is to spray this blue dust upon her every time she's to get this story. And supposedly we end up finding out that that blue dust is for her to keep her powers. Supposedly, because she ended up taking these powers from a much more older witch, which had kept her there because she is the unicorn wielding girl that tried to overthrow this older witch and keep her like caught into this coffin, which that is the reason why Alex is to speak all these stories to nullify this older witch to keep her asleep every night, or otherwise this girl will wake up. So Alex eventually does this story. And there's also a spot where both Alex and Yasmin are to go through this weird like garden where like all these plants need the nighttime to survive, because if they are to eventually get any spot of daylight in them, these plants are to die off weirdly. So Yasmin is to take care of this one plant that all of a sudden is to crack open these spider monsters for whatever reason. And like I didn't look up what the spider monster names were. I couldn't care. I didn't care. And so these spider monsters are all of a sudden to hatch from this egg from this tree. And so all of a sudden they now have to crazily kill all these spider monsters. And all of a sudden we end up having one spider monster that eventually at the tail end of this movie eventually goes and destroys all of Alex's Nightbooks. Oh no, this random monster coming out of nowhere for whatever reason and destroying these Nightbooks. But it seems we eventually, slowly but surely, like we have the cat in this story who eventually just starts pooping on Alex's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We just see this cat just pooping away, and I'm like, why? Why do we have to see this in this movie? This is freaking gross. But so yeah, we have this cat who at first poops on Alex's peanut butter and jelly, but then eventually this cat is to start helping out these kids whenever they're in trouble. Like eventually the cat ends up in this like web while trying to get at one of these spider monsters, and then eventually we have Alex who ends up helping the cat out of the web, and then eventually gives the cat some medication, and so the cat like starts respecting the other kids and whatever, and just doesn't crap on their PB&Js. So yeah, and this is a really important part that we have to mention in this story for whatever reason. So this kid continues to try to come up with stories every single day when he's not going and reading these passages that are in these books about this whole unicorn girl story. And so eventually the whole thing is that this girl was to supposedly have gotten and escaped from this story, from this witch woman. And so now Alex is to supposedly have hope that he's like, well, all we need is another unicorn necklace, and we can easily just come up with this. So all of a sudden, Alex is to do this story about this bindweed story, where all of a sudden this sorcerer was to have this magical concoction that was to supposedly take down this sleeping monster. And eventually we have all of a sudden Natasha coming in and chiming in, just saying like, well, it's not bindweed, it's some other kind of goofy other thing. Like it's like Cicero or something like that. Where all of a sudden Alex is like, oh, Cicero? Like, oh, okay. So because they were coming up with this magical concoction to try and make Natasha try and sleep. And so the only ingredient that they couldn't figure out was that one thing, which they ended up calling blindweed or bindweed. So eventually what ends up happening is that the sorcerer ends up finding this peasant girl who gives him this ingredient to supposedly take down this monster. But instead the monster wakes up and eats this sorcerer, and then eventually like the peasant girl runs off to think that, oh great, like I had stolen a number of all these gems and I'll be able to go and because evidently this monster bizarrely had gems within him. And so this girl took all these gems, became a millionaire, and all of a sudden the monster came back and ate her. Like that was kind of the main story about that whole thing. So we just consistently have Natasha like just so annoyed with every single one of these stories. And she used to mention like, it doesn't feel like any of these stories have real truth to them, or like you should really come from a place of writing what you know, or something like that. There's always that kind of thing that Natasha is to have that problem with writing of a story of a whatever. So that's to be every single one of these things. So Natasha is to eventually kind of wait for her meal one day. And so now these kids are having this concoction to eventually put in this girl's lemonade, so that way they can serve to her to get her to fall asleep. But they end up putting it into the lemonade, and all of a sudden it changes drastically the color of the lemonade to some kind of dark green. And so Alex is like, I can't just send this out to her. She'll get kind of like, she'll figure things out. So eventually what they figure out to do is the cat ends up taking the concoction and putting it into Natasha's perfume when she used to spray it when she gets that story. So like the people give her the food and then they give her the story, and all of a sudden she starts spraying, and all of a sudden it knocks her out. And then they're like, great, let's get the heck out of here. And so they end up going through the exit door, and we have Yasmin, who ends up getting the spray of Natasha to eventually open this exit door. And so they end up going out to all of a sudden find that this isn't home either. It's just another part of the apartment that they're stuck in. And so all of a sudden they end up finding this unicorn, this blackened unicorn that has this horn on it. And I'm just like, what am I watching? What am I watching? But evidently that's to be Natasha's pet, weirdly enough, if she doesn't have a cat already. So all of a sudden the kids just start running off. They just start running off to eventually find out that it seems that the Hansel and Gretel story was true all along. That there is to be a house that is to all of a sudden have these treats and these sweets, these whatever. So all of a sudden these kids just consume this house of treats, just like in the Hansel and Gretel story. And so all of a sudden we eventually find that these kids eventually head further into this house. And so all of a sudden, eventually Natasha is to wake back up and to imprison Yasmin into this cell that's in this house weirdly. So when Alex is to make it back up, he's to try to break Yasmin out of this cell, but he can't. So now Alex is to get and figure out everything that uh, Natasha was a girl who had tried to get away from that story and have the unicorn necklace, and that this witch was the original witch that Natasha had overpowered and overthrown, and Natasha has been siphoning off this old witch's power for I don't know how long, and so this girl has been like just keeping this old witch asleep from all of these stories that this guy is Alex is to feed her every single night. So it seems that what ends up happening is that Alex is to eventually feed this older witch another story about why he had given up writing and why he's had this writer's block and why he no longer cares to create stories anymore. And that was another story. But then all of a sudden, Alex is to try and wake up this older witch, and he succeeds by shouting right next to her coffin. So this old witch is to all of a sudden wake up to find that Natasha is to see her, and it's like, hey, like, it seems like you have been sitting in this coffin for so long that all of a sudden your candy is starting to infect you. And we just see this witch with like half candy on her, half witch. So all of a sudden we have Natasha trying to outpower this old witch, but eventually Natasha gets chucked into this wall and buried, I guess to eventually just show at the very end of this movie that she just ends up coming back anyways, because there has to be a Nightbook sequel, which I would probably assume is going to happen, right? So now we have these kids just running from this witch and trying to run through this apartment to eventually go into this elevator, and whatever they're doing just really isn't working. And eventually they go to this elevator to head into this boiler room. I'm like, oh, what's gonna happen here? Hansel and Gretel time? I think it's Hansel and Gretel time. So they're in this boiler room, and so this old witch has come on down. She's like, yeah, I'm going to get to you kids. Like, I'm going to eat you because I'm so hungry that she had to barf up whatever she barfed up in the elevator. That's freaking gross. So Alex is to tell this old witch, hey, like, I have a story for you, and like, I'll give you this story if it'll appease you. And so the old witch is like, go on. And so Alex is to spin yarn about this story to really just kind of bide time for him to open up this oven, for Yasmin to come from behind this witch, shove her in the oven, burn her, and then and burn the Nightbook along with it, and just chuck her in this oven and kill her. And so after that is to happen, it seems that eventually they are to figure out how to get out of this place. And so both Yasmin and Alex are to be able to figure out how the heck to get out of there, to have Alex go back to his home, to eventually have Yasmin and her parents reunited supposedly after 3 years. And so all of a sudden we just see Alex, who is just going off and writing his books like crazy. He's written 4 books now, supposedly. And so we have Yasmin, who ends up giving Alex some other kind of like book thing that he can like that's made out of leather and whatever. And so it's like a real like professional style like book writing thing. And so all of a sudden she is to mention about some kind of flower that is to do something with light or something. It's a weird thing. So like, huzzah for both of these characters. They're all happy. They have their happy ending. And so all of a sudden we go back to the figures that were to have been of all the other kids that I guess had gotten stuck here at one point in time. and all became bizarrely action figures for whatever reason, which is to help Alex figure out that not any one of these people have the unicorn necklace, and figure out that, like, okay, so Natasha did escape out of all this. So because like certain people wearing earrings or watches or whatever, and they had to like prominently show the jewelry or whatever that they were to have on them. So out of these action figure things. So I'm wondering probably if any number of these action figure things that they had in this story probably led to some other Nightbook story that it's like, oh yeah, like that's the reason why all those things were probably created. But again, I've never read any of these Nightbook things. I don't know about any of them, so like I don't know. It's just going in here blind or whatever for whatever reason. Like I don't know. I just really didn't enjoy this movie. I just didn't enjoy it. But I think with that said, I think that covers everything. If there's something that I missed or whatever, that's bound to happen. Uh, so yeah, I think I covered everything. I think I'm fine with all of which that I've said. But yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.